14 men in tactical gear arrived before sunrise carrying a steel ram and an eviction order with his name forged across the bottom. Behind them stood the HOA president smiling as if the house already belonged to her. She ordered them to break down the door, drag him outside, and seize everything inside. What she did not know was that the man behind that door had spent 12 years as a Force Recon Marine surviving missions far more dangerous than her hired thugs could imagine. By the time the door shattered, every camera was recording, and every man who stepped inside had walked into the worst mistake of his life. Stay until the end, to see how one forged order destroyed her empire and turned her own hired army against her. Before any of it began, before the trucks and the battering ram, and the woman in the white coat screaming orders across his own front yard, there was only a quiet man and a quiet house, and almost no one in Stonehaven Ridge understood what kind of quiet that truly was. Grant Mercer lived alone in a timber-framed house set on 18 acres at the edge of a neighborhood called Stonehaven Ridge in the rolling hills of Virginia. The land had belonged to his uncle long before any developer ever drew a line on a map, and the house itself had stood there for decades, weathered but solid, long before Stonehaven Ridge existed as anything more than empty pasture land. When a luxury housing development finally rose around it, the newly formed Homeowners Association began sending Grant letters, first polite, then increasingly demanding, insisting that he repaint his house to match their approved palette, remove the flagpole that honored his years of service, relocate his tool shed, and pay a mandatory joining fee of $17,600, even though his property had never been part of their community, and never would be. Grant answered every letter the same way, calmly, and without emotion, attaching copies of his deed, and the county plat map that proved his land had existed independently, since long before the association was chartered. Still, the woman who ran that association, a sharp-featured, immaculately dressed 51-year-old named Marla Voss, kept showing up at his gate with 2 board members trailing behind her, insisting that because Stonehaven Ridge now surrounded his property on 3 sides, he was somehow obligated to follow their rules. Regardless of what the paperwork said, Grant never raised his voice during those visits. He simply asked her to leave his private property, watched her walk back to her car, and quietly noted the license plate, read the time of day, and every word she said, filing it away, the same methodical way he had once filed away terrain features and enemy movements on deployments most people would never hear about. What Marla did not say out loud, though, she was thinking it every time she looked at his land, was that a development company called Westmore Leisure had offered the association $11 million for access to the lake that sat just behind Grant's property. Without a road running through his land, there was no way to reach that lake, and without that lake there was no resort, no $11 million, and no way to quietly cover the enormous hole that had already opened in the association's finance. So when Grant refused to sell, refused to join, and refused to be intimidated, Marla decided that refusal itself was simply an obstacle to be removed, and she said as much on her way back to her car one afternoon, turning at the end of his driveway to tell him that within a month he would no longer be standing on that land. Grant said nothing back. He only watched her leave, and a few days later, an envelope arrived at his mailbox marked as a final eviction and property surrender order, warning that if he did not vacate within 72 hours, the association had the authority to use, in its own words, an authorized enforcement team to remove him. Grant read the forged signature at the bottom, a name belonging to a judge who, as far as he already suspected, had never seen this document in his life, and he understood immediately that Marla Voss had just crossed a line that had nothing left to do with homeowner regulations. Grant photographed the letter and sent copies to his attorney, a meticulous 39-year-old property fraud specialist named Tessa Whitlock, who had warned him months earlier that the association's paperwork looked suspiciously inconsistent. Within a few phone calls, Tessa confirmed what Grant already suspected: there was no lawsuit filed against him anywhere in the county system, no judge had ever signed an eviction order bearing his name, and the case number printed on the document actually belonged to an unrelated bankruptcy filing that had closed 4 years earlier. The court seal had clearly been copied from a public record and pasted onto the page, and the signature on his supposed Homeowners Association membership agreement, the one Marla claimed he had signed years ago, did not match his handwriting. In a single stroke, Tessa wanted to file an emergency injunction immediately, but the courthouse would not review new filings until Monday morning, and Marla's 72-hour deadline expired before dawn on Sunday, a timing that felt far too convenient to be accidental. When Grant contacted the sheriff's office to report the likely threat of an unlawful forced entry, the deputy on duty logged it only as a civil dispute, since the association had already filed its own complaint, accusing Grant of illegally occupying community property, effectively planting a false narrative in the system before anyone in uniform ever set foot on his land. Grant understood exactly what that meant. Someone was building a story designed to make the responding officers arrive already suspicious of him rather than of her, and against a story like that, evidence would matter more than any argument he could make standing on his own porch. His years in Force Recon had never trained him to prepare for a fight. They had trained him to prepare for contact, which was a very different discipline built around detecting intrusion early, documenting everything as it happened, preserving a clear route of retreat, isolating the person giving orders from the people simply following them, and above all avoiding force, unless a life was genuinely at risk. He spent the following day checking his security cameras, motion-activated floodlights and backup power systems, setting every device to mirror its footage automatically to a remote server that Tessa could access the instant anything went wrong. He cleared the entryway of anything that could be mistaken for a weapon, sealed his original deed, his military discharge papers, and copies of every complaint he had filed into a fireproof document bag, and placed a quiet call to a former colleague still working in law enforcement, letting him know that an organized intrusion might be coming to his address. That evening, an unmarked pickup truck circled his property 3 times at a crawling speed, and later Grant found a small signal jamming device clipped to the utility pole nearest his driveway, proof that whoever was coming had already scouted the house and intended to cut off communication the moment they arrived. At 4:43 in the morning, a vibration sensor buried along the Eastern Service Road triggered an alert on Grant's monitor, and through the feed he watched 4 black sport utility vehicles roll to a stop, followed by an equipment truck, and finally Marla's own Mercedes sedan. 14 men climbed out wearing tactical vests, gloves, and matching jackets, stenciled with the words, "Civil Enforcement," an outfit designed to look official to anyone who did not look closely enough to notice there was no agency name, no badge number, and no verifiable authority behind it. One man carried a steel battering ram toward the front door. Another carried a coil of plastic restraints looped over his shoulder like a trophy. Marla stood behind them in a crisp white coat pointing toward the house and calling out for her men to get him outside before the police could arrive. A command spoken with the casual confidence of a woman who had never once imagined the cameras recording every word. Brock Harlan, the 46-year-old owner of a private security firm called Harlan Civil Solutions, led the group up onto the porch and raised a bullhorn, reading aloud a scripted demand for Grant to open the door. Immediately, Grant answered calmly through his own intercom system, informing them that they were standing on private property, that no valid court order existed, and that every second of what was happening was already being recorded. Brock warned that Grant had 30 seconds to surrender before force would be used, and Grant calmly asked him to hold the supposed order up to the camera, where a closed zoom revealed no issuing agency listed anywhere on the page, no raised court seal, and no verification phone number a reasonable person could call to confirm anything printed on it. Grant repeated slowly and clearly enough for the recording to capture every syllable that he was not resisting law enforcement, because the men standing on his porch were not law enforcement at all. And it was at that moment that Marla snatched the bullhorn from Brock's hand and shouted that she was the president of the association and had full authority over every property inside Stonehaven Ridge. When Grant asked her directly on camera whether she was ordering 14 men to break down his door and physically remove him from his own home, Marla answered without hesitation, telling them to break the door, drag him out, and declaring that by the end of the day the house would belong to the association, a confession that would later become the single most damaging piece of evidence in the entire case. 2 men moved forward to block the porch camera with a metal shield, while Brock's crew switched to a hidden power drill, then a hammer striking the reinforced door again and again, as Grant withdrew calmly to a secondary vantage point. Careful never to stand directly behind the door, and careful never to give anyone a reason to claim he had provoked what was coming. He triggered his exterior alarm, flooded the yard with light, sent an emergency alert directly to Tessa, and activated a pre-recorded 911 call that automatically transmitted his address, along with a description of 14 armed men attempting forced entry. Brock's crew realized too late that a second hidden camera embedded in the eaves had survived their jamming device entirely, and as the reality of what they were doing began to sink in, several men slowed their advance, only to be pushed forward again by Marla's screaming reminder that none of them would be paid if Grant remained inside the house. On the 6th strike, the door frame finally split apart, and Brock led 5 men into the living room, expecting to find a frightened, panicked homeowner, cornered and easy to control. Instead, they found Grant standing calmly near the staircase, hands open and visible, to his voice level as he told them they had just committed an armed break-in in front of dozens of cameras, and that whoever set their tools down now would still have a chance to explain that they had been misled. What none of the 14 men understood, not even Brock, who had built an entire career around the appearance of controlled aggression, was that the calm they mistook for fear was actually the most dangerous thing in the room. Grant had spent more nights than he could count, moving through terrain where a single wrong decision meant men under his command did not come home, and against that memory, a crowded living room full of frightened contractors playing dress-up as law enforcement barely registered as a threat at all. Grant never struck first. He retreated instead toward the areas of the house with the clearest camera coverage, forcing every man who followed him to expose his own actions on tape rather than hide behind the confusion of a crowded room. When Brock lunged forward with a set of plastic restraints, Grant used a simple, efficient release technique to redirect the momentum of the grab, sending Brock stumbling off balance without a single blow being thrown. And when another man swung a metal baton toward him, Grant simply shifted a heavy table between them, using the obstacle rather than his fists to blunt the great of fists. Attack. Years of reconnaissance training had taught him to maintain distance, avoid being surrounded, funnel opponents into narrow hallways where only one man could reach him at a time, and read the position of every hand and waistband in the room to separate who was genuinely dangerous from who was simply frightened and following orders they had already begun to regret. 2 men spotted the camera mounted near the ceiling and tried to tear it down, only for Grant to remind them in the same even tone he had used all night that the footage had already left the building and was safely stored somewhere. They appetivous ever ediso, could never reach play. A single sentence that caused 3 more men to lower their tools and begin quietly asking Brock whether the eviction order was even real. Brock threatened to withhold their pay and ordered them to keep going, but the unity of the group was already coming apart at the seams. And when a man named Wade Kessler pulled a canister of chemical spray from his belt, Grant yanked a heavy curtain down as a shield, deflected the spray, and shut Wade off behind a locked interior door before he could reach anyone else, using only the force necessary to stop the immediate threat and nothing more. From the yard, Marla watched her plan collapsing in real time and ordered 2 of her remaining men into Grant's study to retrieve the property deed, a command that revealed her true objective far more clearly than any eviction ever could. This was never simply about removing Grant from the land. It was about seizing and destroying the one document that legally proved he owned it. Grant heard the order through his own intercom feed and let them break open a decoy safe he had deliberately placed in plain sight, and the 2 men triumphantly carried out a sealed envelope they believed contained the original deed, unaware that the camera recorded every second of Marla's own voice directing them to take it. Grant then called out to Brock directly, reminding him that Marla was standing safely outside while 14 other men absorbed all of the criminal exposure inside the house. And as Brock glanced through the shattered doorway to see Marla already backing toward her car, Grant told to him plainly that she would call this an operation that had gone rogue the moment police arrived, insisting she had never authorized anyone to break down a single door. Whatever loyalty had held the group together evaporated in that instant, and when sirens finally echoed down the access road, Marla spun on her heel, ran toward the arriving patrol car in tears, and screamed that Grant had attacked her enforcement team and was a dangerous armed former soldier who needed to be subdued immediately. Sheriff Nolan Price, a cautious 55-year-old who valued evidence over assumptions, arrived with 6 deputies to find a shattered front door, more than a dozen men in matching tactical gear, and Grant standing alone in plain civilian clothes, as Marla insisted he had violently resisted a lawful eviction while Brock offered a vaguer claim that his team had simply been assisting in an asset recovery. Nolan ordered Grant out of the house with his hands raised, and Grant complied instantly, without argument and without invoking his military background to demand special treatment, even as Marla shouted for deputies to handcuff him on the spot. Grant simply asked them to examine the seal on the document Marla was holding and to review the security footage beginning at 4:43 that morning, and when Nolan checked the case number printed on her supposed order, he found it belonged to no active filing in the county system, and the retired judge whose name appeared on the signature line had left the bench years earlier. Tessa called at that exact moment, confirming she already held a certified copy of Grant's original deed and had warned the sheriff's office days earlier about the very real possibility of an unlawful forced entry at this address. When Grant handed over access to the stored footage, Nolan and his deputies watched the entire sequence unfold in order, Marla ordering the door broken down, Grant repeatedly warning them they were trespassing Brock's crew, hammering through the frame, Marla directing her men toward the study to seize the deed. Grant standing unarmed throughout the restraints and chemical spray carried by Brock's team, a camera being deliberately blocked. And finally Marla attempting to retreat to her car the moment sirens appeared. Nolan ordered his deputies to separate all 14 men for individual statements, and Brock beginning to grasp that Marla had handed him a completely fabricated legal order. admitted that the entire contract for his services had come directly from the association's office and had been signed personally by Marla, a claim she immediately tried to deny by insisting her own signature had been forged as well. But Brock produced a recorded voicemail in which Marla promised an additional $10,000 if his team finished the job before the courthouse reopened, and when one of the younger deputies noticed a framed force reconnaissance insignia inside the wreckage of Grant's study and asked whether he had served in that unit. Grant answered simply that he had spent 12 years there, a short reply that visibly unsettled Brock, who suddenly understood how much restraint Grant had shown when he could easily have caused far greater harm. Nolan placed Brock in handcuffs for organized breaking and entering and destruction of property, then turned toward Marla, who smiled with the easy confidence of a woman, certain her social standing would protect her, only to be told she was not permitted to leave the county, because a state investigator was already on her way. That investigator, a 44-year-old financial fraud specialist named Audrey Sloan, arrived, minutes later carrying a thick case file and telling Marla plainly that the authorities were not there, only because of a broken door. Audrey explained that her division had been quietly investigating Stonehaven Ridge's Homeowners Association for 6 months after an audit revealed the community's reserve fund, which should have held more than $4,100,000, was now missing roughly $2,800,000, drained through phantom consulting fees, maintenance contracts with companies that did not exist, emergency security charges, payments to vendors, sharing addresses with Marla's own properties, and a secret deposit tied to the Westmore resort deal. Marla needed the lake access secured quickly to plug that enormous financial hole before the annual audit exposed her. But the only route to the construction site ran directly across Grant's land, and when he refused to sell, she and a corrupted attorney had fabricated documents, claiming his late uncle had once agreed to fold the property into the association, followed by a cascade of false fines, a fraudulent 2008 seizure order, forged meeting minutes, the counterfeit eviction notice, and finally the contract hiring Brock's team, all built on the same forged judicial signature. Audrey explained further that the scheme had not happened overnight. It had been built patiently over nearly 2 years, one falsified invoice at a time, one quiet transfer at a time, until the gap between what the reserve fund should have held and what it actually held became too large to hide behind ordinary bookkeeping errors. Vendors that existed only on paper had billed the association for landscaping work, never performed, and security patrols that never once drove past a single house. And the addresses tied to those vendors led investigators straight back to properties owned directly or through relatives by Marla herself. When auditors finally cross-referenced the timeline, they found that every acceleration in Marla's spending correlated almost exactly with milestones in her secret negotiations with Westmore, as though each payment toward silence or cooperation had been drawn from the very community she claimed to be protecting. The decoy envelope her men had stolen from Grant's study contained a tiny tracking device he had planted inside it, and that device was later found sitting in the trunk of Marla's own Mercedes footage, clearly showing one of her men handing it to her directly, which Tessa argued proved far more than a simple misunderstanding over property lines. It proved unmistakable intent to seize the deed and permanently erase Grant's legal claim to his own land. Hoping to reduce his own exposure, Brock handed investigators the signed contract bearing Marla's name, text messages, instructing his crew to bring restraints a hand-drawn map of the interior of Grant's house, photographs of the windows and cameras, and an order requiring Grant to be taken to a storage warehouse and held there for 6 hours, while his phone and computer were confiscated, along with proof that $30,000 had already been paid from the association's account before the operation even began. That detail about the warehouse changed the entire complexion of the case, because it meant Marla had never simply wanted Grant removed from the property. She had wanted him detained illegally long enough for a demolition crew to level the house and create a situation no court could undo, believing that once the building was gone, Grant would have no choice but to accept a token settlement, rather than fight to reclaim empty land. Audrey ordered a search of the association's offices, and when investigators arrived, they found smoke rising from the rear of the building, where someone was burning boxes of financial records in a metal drum, and the person standing beside that fire, watching years of evidence turn to ash, was the association's own vice president. Deputies extinguished the fire before most of the documents were destroyed, and because Grant's own backup systems had already mirrored the association's compromised financial software months earlier through a separate audit trail, Tessa had quietly arranged investigators recovered nearly everything anyway. 4 members of the board were found to have accepted payments from Marla in exchange for approving the Westmore agreement without ever bringing it to a resident vote, And when an emergency community meeting was called at the neighborhood clubhouse, Marla insisted on attending, still convinced she could shape the narrative in front of her neighbors the way she always had. She stood before hundreds of homeowners and claimed that Grant was dangerous, that Brock's team had acted far beyond their authorized scope, that she had only ever wanted to enforce reasonable community standards, that the financial investigation was a smear campaign orchestrated by people who resented the association, and that Grant himself had engineered the entire confrontation to extract a payout from the community's funds. Tessa answered by playing the recording for the entire room, letting Marla's own voice fill the silence, as she ordered her men to break the door, drag him out, and declared the house theirs. And no one in that hall said a word, until Audrey stepped forward to reveal the $30,000 payment made from the association's account directly to Brock's company before a single deputy had ever been called. Residents who had trusted Marla for years began asking why their dues had climbed by 38% over 18 months, why the road repair fund had quietly disappeared, why an $11 million agreement with a private developer had never once come up for a community vote, and why association money had apparently been used to fund an armed assault on a man who was not even a member of their organization. When Grant finally rose to speak, he made no mention of medals or deployments and asked for no sympathy. He told the room plainly that the real failure here was not that Marla had happened to choose a former Force Reconnaissance Marine as her target. The failure was that she believed she had the right to do this to anyone at all, and he added that she should not have failed only because he knew how to defend himself, but because no resident anywhere should ever need combat experience simply to feel safe inside the walls of their own home. That statement shifted the room decisively in his favor, and by the end of the meeting, residents voted to suspend the entire board, replacing it with a temporary committee tasked with cooperating fully with state investigators, while Westmore Leisure publicly withdrew from the resort deal and claimed it had been misled, a claim that fell apart when Audrey later uncovered an internal email in which a Westmore project director had explicitly instructed Marla to, in his own words, resolve the landowner before construction began. Marla was arrested that same evening on charges of organized unlawful entry forgery of official documents, unlawful detention, conspiracy, misappropriation of association funds, obstruction of an ongoing investigation, and inciting the forger, destruction of evidence. And as deputies led her out of the clubhouse, she turned back to Grant and told him he thought he had one warning that the bank would seize his house before any lawsuit ever reached its conclusion. Grant had no idea what she meant until the following morning, when he learned that Marla had secretly used forged paperwork to place a $3,600,000 mortgage against his own land. A finance company called Briarstone Capital sent him a default notice claiming he had borrowed that exact sum using the property as collateral and had missed payments for 8 months straight, even though Grant had never taken out any such loan in his life. Tessa's investigation quickly uncovered a forged deed, a copy of an old driver's license photograph, a counterfeit electronic signature, an email account that had never belonged to Grant, a notary secretly hired by Marla, and a chain of shell companies that funneled the borrowed money through several intermediaries before landing, partly in the Westmore project and partly in Marla's own personal accounts. Grant sat through the reading of that default notice twice before the words fully registered, because in 12 years of deployments and a decade of civilian life afterward, he had never once missed a payment on anything he actually owed. The idea that his own home could be quietly mortgaged out from under him by a woman already sitting in a jail cell struck him as almost absurd, until he remembered exactly how far she had already been willing to go. Briarstone initially insisted it had loaned the money in good faith, and still retained the right to foreclose regardless of how the funds were later used, forcing Tessa to prove the bank had ignored clear warning signs of fraud from the very beginning. Reviewing months of surveillance footage, Grant recognized one of the 14 men from the original break-in visiting a small notary office 3 weeks before that morning's attack, and Brock now cooperating fully with prosecutors. Confirmed that Marla had paid the same man to impersonate Grant during a video verification call with the lending company. Traffic cameras, phone records, and payroll documents proved that the real Grant had actually been working at an energy facility more than 200 miles away on the exact day that loan was supposedly signed, and Tessa moved immediately for an emergency order to block any foreclosure while the fraud was formally litigated. At the hearing, Briarstone's attorney tried to suggest Grant might have staged the entire episode himself to escape a legitimate debt, but Tessa methodically laid out the original deed, an independent handwriting analysis. Marla's own internal computer records the surveillance footage of the impersonator, the flow of stolen funds into association accounts, the secret contract with Westmore, and finally the video of 14 men storming the house, specifically to seize the very deed now being disputed. The judge declared the mortgage entirely void, and ordered Briarstone to surrender its internal compliance records to federal investigators, since it later emerged that one of the bank's own compliance officers had flagged the paperwork as suspicious months earlier, only to be overruled by a regional director eager not to jeopardize future business tied to the far larger Westmore development. With Grant's ownership permanently secured, Tessa moved to freeze every remaining asset connected to the conspiracy, including Marla's home, the personal accounts of the board members who had taken payoffs, the corporate holdings of Brock's now collapsing security firm, the funds Westmore had already transferred, and the association's own liability insurance policy, telling Grant simply that if they had wanted to turn his house into their asset, then their assets could now stand as security for the damages owed to him. Months later, the criminal charges and Grant's civil case reached trial together, and the 14 men who had once stood united on his porch scattered into very different outcomes depending on how far each had gone. Those who had actively assaulted him or destroyed property faced the harshest charges. Those who had hesitated and later cooperated received far more lenient treatment. And Brock, having pleaded guilty to conspiracy, testified openly against Marla, revealing that 2 of his men had been told to make Grant, in Marla's own words, disappear for a few hours, and that another had been assigned to bring a bulldozer to the property once Grant was gone. Grant himself testified calmly, and when Marla's attorney tried to portray him as a dangerous ex-soldier who had lured innocent men into a trap, Grant simply explained that he had prepared his cameras and backup systems because Marla had already promised in advance that she would take his home, and that his preparation had been meant to keep the truth alive, not to hurt anyone. When Marla took the stand herself, confident she could still win over the jury, she claimed Grant threatened the community and insisted the resort project would have brought economic benefit to everyone, only for Tessa to ask whether that benefit was meant for the community or for the $2,800,000 Marla had already stolen from it, a question that finally broke her composure, as she blurted out that she deserved that money for turning Stonehaven Ridge into a place worth living. Tessa continued methodically asking Marla under oath whether she had ordered the door broken, whether she had instructed her men to seize the deed, whether she had hired someone to impersonate Grant for the fraudulent loan, whether she intended to demolish his house before the courts could intervene, and whether association funds had been funneled into her private development deal, and each time Marla denied it, Tessa answered with the recording, the email, or the bank transfer that proved otherwise. The most damning piece came from an email Marla had once sent to a Westmore director describing Grant as nothing more than an isolated man living alone, and promising that 14 men would teach him that ownership only exists for those strong enough to defend it. And Tessa told the jury plainly that Grant had indeed proven strong enough to defend it, but the strength that saved him was never his fists. It was evidence restraint and the law itself. The deliberation lasted less than a day, a fact that surprised almost no one who had sat through the trial and watched Marla's own words undo every excuse her attorneys tried to build around her. Jurors later said the recording of her standing on Grant's porch, ordering 14 men to break his door and drag him out, had been the single hardest piece of evidence to explain away, since no amount of legal argument could soften a sentence spoken in her own voice, in her own certainty, believing at the time that no one capable of stopping her was listening. The jury found Marla, the compromised board members, Harlan Civil Solutions, and Westmore, jointly liable, awarding Grant $12,400,000 to cover the destruction of his home, lost income, security expenses, legal costs, the violation of his property rights, emotional harm, and punitive damages for the deliberate fraud and unlawful detention conspiracy behind it all, with the association's insurance covering only a fraction since Marla's actions were ruled intentional rather than accidental, leaving the rest secured by the very assets Tessa had frozen months earlier. In the criminal proceeding that followed, the judge sentenced Marla to a lengthy prison term as the architect of the entire scheme, and as she was led away in handcuffs, she looked back at Grant one final time and told him he had taken everything from her, to which Grant simply replied that she was the one who had carried everything to his front door herself. In the months that followed, Marla's remaining property was liquidated under court order to satisfy the judgment, along with the assets of the board members who had taken her money, though Grant never sought to seize their homes out of personal vengeance. He insisted instead that the settlement be handled transparently and that residents with no part in the fraud remain untouched. Part of the award went toward repairing his own home, restoring a section of woodland that Westmore had illegally surveyed without permission, establishing a legal defense fund for homeowners facing similar abuse from overreaching associations, funding an independent auditing system for Stonehaven Ridge itself, and supporting veterans transitioning into civilian security work the right way, with accountability and oversight built in from the start. Harlan Civil Solutions was permanently dissolved, and Brock, After serving his sentence and cooperating fully throughout the investigation, eventually wrote Grant a letter of apology, admitting that he had once believed a uniform and a large enough group of men could turn wrongdoing into something that looked like authority, a belief Grant did not forgive. Easily but acknowledged, had at least helped expose the far larger conspiracy underneath it all. Stonehaven Ridge elected an entirely new board under a fresh set of rules, requiring every major contract to be made public, prohibiting any single president from unilaterally hiring outside enforcement, guaranteeing residents an independent to appeal process for any fine, mandating an annual audit of the DOD. Reserve fund banning the use of community money for disputes beyond the association's actual boundaries and requiring every board meeting to be recorded and archived for anyone to review. Several longtime residents later admitted quietly and a little ashamed that they had known something was wrong for years and had simply chosen not to ask questions, trusting that a woman as polished and confident as Marla could not possibly to be capable of the things now spread across every newspaper, covering the case, and that discomfort became its own kind of lesson for the community, one that no set of bylaws alone could fully repair. The new board made a point of inviting Grant to its first public session, not as a member but as a guest, and though he declined to speak at length, he did tell the room that oversight only works when people are willing to look closely, even at leaders they like, especially at leaders they like, since comfort was exactly the condition Marla had relied upon for years, before anyone thought to check her numbers. Grant still never joined the association, and the court's final ruling permanently affirmed the independence of his land, yet something had shifted in how the neighborhood saw him. The same neighbors who had once avoided him because of Marla's rumors now understood that he had been the one person willing to stand still long enough to expose a corrupt system that had already been quietly stealing from every one of them. A year after that morning, Grant stood before a new front door made of solid oak, the frame still bearing a small dent from the hammer that had once split it open, and when Tessa visited and asked why he had never replaced that section of wood, Grant told her the mark reminded him that a door is never protected by a lock alone. It is protected by ownership, by preparation, by evidence, by people willing to speak the truth when it matters, and by a legal system that, however slowly, still holds the powerful accountable when the proof is undeniable. Sheriff Nolan stopped by that same week and handed Grant the final closed case file, its cover page showing the photograph taken that first morning of 14 men standing outside his house, remarking that Marla had clearly picked the wrong man to threaten. Grant shook his head and told him that no one had ever been the right person for her to do that to. And as the imagined camera pulled back from the property past the gate where a line of black vehicles had once come pouring through, a new sign now stood beside the road, carrying no threats and no warnings at all, reading simply that this was private property, its rights defended by law. Grant closed the door behind him, and this time the sound it made no longer belonged to a man isolating himself from the world outside. It belonged to a man who had finally reclaimed the quiet, uncontested peace of standing inside a home that was at last and beyond any forged paper or false authority, entirely his own. Inside, he set the closed case file on the kitchen table beside a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, and for a long moment he simply stood at the window watching the light move across the same hills his uncle had once pointed out, to him as a boy long before any of this had a name. He thought briefly about the 14 men who had walked through that door believing size and numbers could substitute for legitimacy, and about the one woman who had believed a title and a bank account could substitute for the law itself, and he understood that the lesson underneath all of it was simpler than anyone in that courtroom had made it sound. Power borrowed from intimidation always eventually meets someone who refuses to be intimidated, and when it does, every document forged to support it, every dollar quietly diverted to sustain it, and every person willing to look away from it, comes due all at once. Grant Mercer had not needed to win a fight that morning. He had only needed to survive it long enough for the truth to catch up, and in the end the truth arrived exactly as it always does for those patient enough to protect it slowly, thoroughly, and without mercy, for the people who had counted on it never showing up at all.